So I'm honored today to read from my new book, which is right here. It's called Stereotypes, How Society Sexualizes Us and How We Can Fight Back. And so basically the book, as you can probably tell from the title, is about sexualization, which sometimes people define in different ways. The definition I use in the book is when we non-consensually reduce other people to their real or imagined sexual attributes, their bodies, behaviors, or desires, to the exclusion of other characteristics, or rather than seeing them as whole people. And most of us are familiar with conversations about sexualization from feminists, talking about the ways in which women in kind of a straight male-centered world are often sexually objectified or slut-shamed or face sexual harassment or sexual violence and so on. And I talk about that in the book. But one of the things that struck me as a trans woman, who sometimes people read me as a cis woman and I get sexualized in those ways, but when people know that I'm a trans woman, I get sexualized in all these other ways, including being stereotyped as sexually deviant or predatory or hypersexual or as desperate or as undesirable or as a fetish object, and so on. And so a lot of these other types of sexualization that I face as a trans woman actually are experienced. There are now analogous counterparts experienced by other marginalized groups, including people of color, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. And all these different forms of sexualization felt interconnected to me, and so the book is really about exploring how they are interconnected and making the argument that we should challenge all forms of sexualization. One more thing I should say is that I talk in the book about the predator-prey mindset. And what that means, it's this idea that we're generally in our culture socialized to believe how sex works. And that's the idea that like men are supposedly sexual aggressors and women are sexual objects. And so like canonically men are supposed to be the pursuers, they pursue the women. And often sex is imagined as kind of like the woman being the sex or having the sex and the men taking the sex from them. And I argue that there's an imagined transfer of stigma involved there, which is kind of this idea that when a woman is a virgin, she's supposedly pure, but then she has sex and she's somewhat like exposed, like soiled or tainted or used, right? And if women have too much sex, they're like ruined, right? And so these horrible ideas are related to stigma, and stigma is faced by all marginalized groups, and it's often imagined to be contagious. So that's all you need to know, and we're just going to dive into the middle of the queer chapter. Because queer people confound predator-prey roles and rules, we are marked by sex in many people's eyes. When I was growing up, people who fancied themselves tolerant would often say, "I don't care what you do in your bedroom, just don't flaunt it in front of me," in response to people who simply mentioned that they had a same-sex partner, or engaged in displays of affection such as hand-holding. These acts, which would have gone unnoticed and uncommented upon if they'd occurred in the straight majority, were treated as if they were sexual acts that needed to be kept private. Even today, chaste kissing between queer couples is sometimes viewed as indecent, and books that include LGBTQIA+ characters are among the most targeted for censorship, even if they are bereft of any explicit sexual content. In other words, we are seen as sexual beings through and through. And because many people view us as fakes, and what I mean by that is we're seen as fakes because straight is real and anything that's not straight is fake. They routinely invent ulterior sexual motivations to explain who we are and what we do. Here are a few of the most common sexualizing stereotypes and attributions that we are subjected to. One way in which people rationalize queer individuals and relationships is by presuming that we merely mimic our straight counterparts. For instance, when confronted with a same-sex couple, people will often ask questions or make assumptions about which partner is the butch or boy and which is the femme or girl, even though many queer relationships do not break down along clear masculine-feminine or top-bottom lines. Another example of how we are imagined to be inferior copies of straightness is implicit inversion. the presumption that queer men are inherently more feminine in appearance, mannerisms, and behaviors than straight men, and queer women reciprocally more masculine than straight women. While we can all think of examples of people who seem to fit such descriptions, as is true of any stereotype, I lost my place there. Multiple lines of evidence have shown that queer people are far more diverse in our personalities and behaviors than this, and that perceivers cannot accurately deduce a person's sexual orientation based solely on appearance. Furthermore, studies have shown that perceivers who are told that a man is gay will rate him as less masculine or more feminine than perceivers who are not given this information, thus illustrating that implicit inversion is a function of perceiver bias. While the belief that queer people must either be womanly men or manly women directly contradicts the previous presumption that same-sex couples must fall into boy-girl pairings, both of these stereotypes make superficial sense as attempts to preserve predator-prey logic. In addition to supposedly striving to imitate the opposite sex, queer people are paradoxically portrayed as adhering to the predator-prey roles that are associated with our birth-assigned sex. For instance, gay male relationships are widely stereotyped as hypersexual, in part because they seem to possess an excess of sexual aggressors, but also because gay male relationships seemingly lack a proper sexual object. People often imagine gay male sex as being primarily about personal gratification, rather than sexual attraction or interpersonal desire. Indeed, this likely informs the recurring stereotype of male homosexuality as hedonistic and decadent. Lesbian relationships pose a different problem. While two women being attracted to one another is not so far-fetched, as they're both deemed to be sexual objects, people tend to view them as lacking a legitimate sexual aggressor to initiate sex. Indeed, in many people's minds, the lack of a penis renders lesbian sex either non-existent or irrelevant. This presumption that two women cannot possibly have real sex, read male-initiated and penis-centered, surely influences popular stereotypes of lesbian relationships as merely involving expressions of affection and commitment, sans sex, as seen in the popular lesbian bed death and U-Haul syndrome memes. And I should say, since Becca mentioned my novel 99 Erics, I go on a rant, or my bisexual protagonist in the book goes on a rant about the whole lesbian, deathbed meme, which is, yeah, I have a lot of issues with that. So anyway, that was a little digression, a tiny digression. I'm gonna take a sip of water now. Okay. Perhaps the quintessential example of this presumption can be found in the lesbian porn created by and for straight men, wherein the supposed lesbians, usually portrayed by straight-appearing female actors, engage in kissing and fondling, that is foreplay, until a male actor enters the scene and says something like, "Can I join you, ladies?" At which point the supposed real sex begins. The fact that many people don't consider woman-on-woman sex real sex can also be gleaned from how lesbians and asexual women face many of the same fakeness tropes. Specifically, both groups are told that they will inevitably turn straight once they meet the right man or experience one good fuck, that is, involving a penis. And both are sometimes threatened with or subjected to corrective rape, so named because perpetrators believe that the assault will either turn or scare the victim straight. In her book, The Invisible Orientation, asexual activist Julie Sandra Decker lists and refutes common myths about why people are asexual. And it's striking how many of them are also used to explain and undermine homosexuality, despite these orientations being quite different. These supposed explanations include having had bad past sexual relationships or sexual experiences, having been sexually abused as a child, merely going through a phase, how many times have you heard that, repressing sexual feelings, or being unattractive or insufficiently womanly or manly to attract a partner. This suggests that both groups are viewed as similarly lacking the appropriate heterosexual desires. Bisexuals, on the other hand, are not seen as lacking desires, but rather as having an overabundance of them. Because bisexuals do not limit our dating pool to a single sex or gender, we tend to be viewed as impulsive and indiscriminate in our partner choices. Hence the hypersexualized stereotypes of us being attracted to anything that moves and unable to commit to other people. As we saw in the disparity between lesbian and gay stereotypes, there are notable gender differences in how bisexual women and men are viewed. While bisexual men are largely invisible and even presumed by some to not exist, bisexual women are often publicly sexualized and portrayed as easy or asking for sexual attention. These latter presumptions likely contribute to the fact that bisexual women experience rape at roughly 3 times higher than either our lesbian or heterosexual counterparts. Another gender difference that's been repeatedly observed is that perceivers who view bisexuality through a prism of fakeness often presume that bisexual men are really gay, and that bisexual women are really heterosexual. The best explanation that I've seen to account for this discrepancy comes from an essay entitled Phallocentrism and Bisexual Invisibility by Mickey R. As the title suggests, the author makes the case that male and penis-centric views of sex lead men to be labeled as gay as soon as they have a single sexual experience with another man, and forever afterwards, regardless of any future experiences with women. In contrast, bisexual women's experiences with other women don't count in many people's eyes due to the lack of male initiators and penises, as discussed before for lesbians. But for the same reasons, her sexual experiences with men do count. Thus, she's misconstrued as a heterosexual who merely fools around with other women. In making this case, Mickey R. uses the refrain, "dick contaminates," which, as soon as you start thinking about this and you experience how other people view sex, all of a sudden it's like, yes, that's what everyone believes sex is. Everyone meaning kind of the straight majority, right? And a lot of people in queer communities too, which I might touch on in a second or during the question and answer session. Okay, anyway, so like yes. In making this case, Mickey R. uses the refrain "dick contaminates" to emphasize how our perceived, rather than our actual sexual orientations, are largely determined by whether or not we've been contaminated by penises, and I would add the sexual stigma they allegedly bestow. The essay also highlights the parallels that exist between sexual categories that are deemed pure, for example, virgins, real men, and gold star lesbians, as a result of eschewing penises, and those that are considered tainted, such as slut or faggot, and most certainly bisexuals, as a result of coming into contact with them. A different gender disparity can also be found in popular presumptions of transgender people. And I'll pause here. I'm going to skip over a bit at this point. Not because transgender people are not interesting, because we are, but because there are other sections I want to share. So I go into stereotypes about trans people, and particularly I start getting into the sexual deceiver idea that trans people are really saddled with. I make an argument that part of the reason is what I call the worst of both worlds, which is the idea that men are sexualized in some ways and women as others. Like men, and especially marginalized men, are often sexualized as sexual predators, and women as either promiscuous or sexually available. And I think trans people get both of those simultaneously a lot of times. And so I talk about that. But I don't think that's all there is to the situation. And so I will skip ahead to where I broaden this out to all queer people, including bisexuals. While the worst of both worlds likely plays some role in contributing to these incidents, that was a belch from the bubbly water. I believe that it offers an incomplete picture of sexual deceiver dynamics. After all, many cisgender people whose anatomies fall squarely into the male or female camps are also misconstrued as sexual deceivers. Straight people often claim to feel deceived when a same-sex acquaintance, whom they assumed was straight, expresses romantic or sexual interest in them. In some cases, they may even respond with violence, much as they do with transgender deceivers. Furthermore, as with trans and intersex depictions, there is a long history of fictional, bisexual, lesbian, and gay characters being depicted as deceitful, sexually driven killers and villains. Thus, it appears that any gender or sexual minority may be saddled with the sexual deceiver stereotype as a result of forgoing predator-prey roles and rules that others expect us to follow. Given our earlier discussions of how lesbians tend to be viewed as incapable of initiating real sex due to a lack of penis, it's worth considering the absolutely contradictory stereotype that they may nevertheless be sexual deceivers and thus predators. Fears that lesbians sexually prey on women and children were pervasive throughout the 20th century. I'm going to skip ahead. I have a couple quotes of examples of this that I felt like I needed to put in there because a lot of people who are, let's say, trans-exclusionary feminists, who are often lesbian identified, really like to saddle trans people with the idea that you're preying on women and children. It's like, yes, that is exactly what they said about you like a couple decades ago. Okay, so anyway, so I go through some quotes establishing that. While concerns about lesbians sexually preying on women and children appear inconsistent with standard predator-prey mindset, there is another way to conceptualize them. Essentially, the sexual deceiver narrative establishes a secondary predator-prey dichotomy in which straight people imagine themselves to be potential prey and envision queer people as predators who, via deception, attempt to take sex from them. And just as men and their penises are imagined to impart stigma upon those whom they come into sexual contact with, queer individuals are similarly presumed to impart queer stigma upon those whom we sexually interact with. In accordance with this, if a queer person expresses sexual interest in a straight individual, or vice versa, the latter may feel as though they've been dirtied or soiled by the interaction. I'll skip over an example of this. This queer stigma model helps explain two recurring reactions that are not adequately addressed by the worst of both worlds. First, it explains why some straight people fear that they might be turned queer by such interactions, even if no sex or intimacy takes place. On an intellectual level, most of us understand that an individual's gender identity or sexual orientation will not magically change if a queer person unexpectedly propositions or interacts with them. If this were true, there would inevitably be queer rogues running around propositioning people willy-nilly in an attempt to turn them all queer. It would totally happen, except that it doesn't work that way. But yeah, on a gut level, many straight people do react to these incidents as though their own gender and sexuality have been brought into question or compromised. I'd argue that this is because people imagine that queer stigma is capable of contaminating others. Indeed, there's a long history of people presuming that queerness must be contagious. We saw an example of this last chapter, which you are not privy to, but it involved 19th century sexologists claims that people who were turned into inverts, an old word for queer people, that this happened because they had interactions with other degenerates. A second recurring reaction, which we've already seen with regards to lesbians, is that queer people are often imagined to prey not only on straight adults, but also on children. Research has demonstrated that queer people are no more likely to commit acts of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse than straight people. Thus, these preying on children claims are nothing more than a defamatory stereotype, one that has been weaponized against other marginalized groups as well. Historian Warren Blumfeld writes at length about the parallels between how LGBTQIA+ people and Jewish people have been depicted by straight Christian majority, including how both groups have been accused, quote, of acting as dangerous predators concentrated on ensnaring, torturing, and devouring primarily women and children of the dominant group.
Ooh.
Yeah, I wrote this like a year ago, and like all this stuff is like, there was evidence of it before, and QAnon had been around before, and people have been accusing trans people of stuff for a while now, but this has obviously exploded over the last year. Historian Gillian Frank's work highlights the overlapping rhetoric employed by white social conservatives against Black and LGBTQIA plus people in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s. This includes unsubstantiated charges that desegregation would ultimately lead to child molestation and Black sexual violence against women and children.
Jeez.
Similarly, Anita Bryant's 1977 Save Our Children campaign charged that gay people were pedophiles and child molesters who were out to recruit children. So I'm going to skip over a couple paragraphs. So basically, I wrote this like a year ago, and so I talk about how like now people are making these charges about trans people, and this was all before like April's what I call the groomer explosion, where like the only like words that like Republicans have anymore is like grooming, right? So I go into quite a bit more, but I want to get to the very end of the chapter, so I'm going to skip over a couple things in order to do that. Since LGBTQIA plus people differ from the norms with regards to our sex, gender, and our sexuality, our stigma is often viewed as inherently sexual in nature. Hence the ease with which social conservatives reappropriate language intended to describe actual sexual violence and deploy it against us, even in entirely non-sexual contexts. That said, I don't think that this is an entirely queer-specific phenomenon. Since many people unconsciously conceptualize sex itself in terms of imagined transfers of stigma from one person to another, it's not that much of a stretch for perceivers to read sexual motives and meanings into non-sexual interactions with other stigmatized groups. This is especially the case for perceivers who are already apprehensive about sex and sexuality to begin with. Social conservatives. Perhaps this is why white segregationists were so quick to connect the issue of school integration to seemingly unrelated fears about child molestation and miscegenation, as Gillian Frank recounts. Of course, some agents of moral panic know exactly what they're doing. They have clear racist or homophobic or transphobic, etc. agenda, and they purposely make baseless claims about sexual predation in order to smear that group. But the success of these campaigns, the reason why they resonate with the masses, likely stems from our tendency to unconsciously view stigma as both contagious and deeply intertwined with sexual violation. So now this is the last section of the chapter. You're like, could it get even more depressing, Julia? And I'm like, no, we can fight back. And how we can fight back is in the subtitle, okay? Okay. In response to the preceding section, some might suggest that things are nevertheless slowly getting better, and that other genders and sexual minorities will eventually transcend these awful deceiver and predator stereotypes, just as lesbian and gay people largely have. But I don't believe it's that simple. The sharp increase in the acceptance of same-sex relationships here in the United States may not be replicable for other gender and sexual minorities for two main reasons: respectability politics and contagiousness politics. Respectability politics refers to attempts by marginalized groups to garner acceptance by convincing the dominant majority that they too are normal and therefore worthy of respect. We saw this happen with the mainstream gay rights movement over the last half-century, as activists and organizations worked to shift the public discourse away from the disreputable topic of sexuality and toward more respectable issues, such as marriage, adoption, and military service. This respectability strategy is perhaps best captured in the popular slogan, "We're just like you except for our sexual orientation." Notably, this slogan does not call for straight people to accept queerness per se, nor does it claim that all queer people deserve to be treated with respect. Rather, it implies that there are respectable people and disreputable ones, and that the we, in We're Just Like You, deserve to be in the former category. Of course, in a society where many people are deemed disreputable because of their race, class, disability, or other traits, these appeals to respectability failed many multiply marginalized queer people. Furthermore, queer subpopulations who were viewed as particularly disreputable at the time, such as bisexual and transgender people, were often explicitly excluded from the movement over concerns that we might hold back the progress of gay and lesbian people. In other words, respectability politics always leaves behind the most marginalized, as well as the most sexualized, segments of any marginalized group. For this reason, many contemporary queer activists are opposed to recycling this strategy. Contagiousness politics is a term of my own making, and it refers to attempts to placate the dominant majority's fears that they might become infected or contaminated by a particular marginalized group. For LGBTQIA+ people, such fears have typically centered on the assumption that straight people can be turned queer via interacting with us. Perhaps the most effective contagiousness politics slogan of the gay rights movement has been, "We're born that way." There have been extensive debates about this slogan, with some queer people expressing concerns that "born this way" suggests that we must suffer from some kind of birth defect. Others are concerned the phrase implies that no one would willingly choose to be queer, and or that it erases some individuals' experiences with shifts in identity or gender and sexual fluidity. While I agree that the slogan fails to capture many intricacies regarding how queer people come to be, I believe its effectiveness lies largely in its ability to allay straight people's fears of contagiousness. After all, if people are born queer, then that means that straight people can't catch it from us. There's another gay rights era message, and this is totally obscure. I can't believe people don't talk about this anymore. This drives me nuts. Okay, there's another gay rights era message that has received considerably less attention, but seems to have served a similar purpose. Namely, lesbians and gay men would often assure straight people that they are not sexually interested in them. They would point out that gay men are attracted to other gay men, and lesbians to other lesbians, and they meet one another in queer-specific settings such as gay bars, or M for M, F for F dating sites. These messages seem designed to convince straight people that they need not panic about being seduced by a queer person. Well, yes, grunt if you want. Feel free to grunt. While the notion that queer and straight people inhabit entirely separate dating pools may hold true for exclusively lesbian and gay people, it does not necessarily apply to other gender and sexual minorities. Bisexuals are attracted to people across multiple genders. Trans and intersex people may vary in their sexual orientations, and so on. In fact, this separate dating pools message insinuates that it would be a bad thing if a queer person were to take interest in a straight person, and vice versa. Such flawed messaging helped to create the apparent paradox that we now find ourselves in, where the straight majority, by and large, openly accepts people who are in same-sex relationships, while simultaneously harboring fears of sexual deception and being contaminated by queerness themselves. I am not suggesting that the progress that has been made regarding same-sex marriage or issues such as adoption and military service are unimportant. But it's crucial that we recognize that these matters are downstream effects of prejudice. And the primary source of this anti-LGBTQIA+ prejudice is the fact that many people view us as fakes and deceivers who breach the roles of predator and prey. This is what leads people to sexualize us. And that sexualization, the fact that we are reduced to the status of sexual deviants, is the reason why we have been historically ostracized and demonized. Mainstream gay rights activism has largely sidestepped this central issue of sexualization. Its respectability politics stance requires us to hide or play down our queer sexualities if we wish to be accepted, not unlike how women are expected to hide or play down our sexualities if we wish to be seen as respectable. Throughout the media, straight sexual desires and encounters are everywhere, whereas the few positive queer characters and couples that exist are almost always depicted as chaste or platonic, so as not to offend straight sensibilities. And while mainstream gay rights activism did alleviate some of straight people's concerns about being turned queer via gay teachers, co-workers, and neighbors, it flat out failed to challenge their fears that they might become corrupted by queerness if they find us sexually attractive and or have intimate relationships with us. If we truly wish to eliminate anti-LGBTQIA+ prejudice, then our activism must confront sexualization head on. Rather than attempting to appease the mainstream by keeping our sexual desires, relationships, and bodies out of sight and out of mind, we should instead challenge their tendency to relentlessly reduce us to these attributes. But this isn't merely an us versus them endeavor. Intra-community sexualization is also quite pervasive. Whether it be the gay men who deride women as fish, trans-exclusionary lesbians who wield the sexual predator trope against trans women, the self-identified true trans people who demean their non-binary and non-heterosexual counterparts as fakes or perverts, or people across the LGBTQIA+ spectrum who dismiss asexual and bisexual individuals as merely sexually confused. Not to mention the countless instances in which LGBTQIA+ individuals sexualize one another because of their race, class, ability, and other factors. Sexualization cuts across all demographics. While it mostly flows down social hierarchies, men tend to sexualize women, white people tend to sexualize people of color, straight people tend to sexualize queer people, etc. It is also something that marginalized people routinely do to one another, and its constant presence hinders all of our social justice movements. Reconceptualizing LGBTQIA+ activism as a movement to end sexualization has numerous advantages. For starters, if we are successful, then we will no longer be saddled with spurious accusations that we are sexual deceivers, deviants, and predators, charges that have long been used to justify our exclusion from society. And since our movement's focus would be on sexualization, rather than any specific identity, there would be far less identity policing and infighting among various LGBTQIA+ subgroups. Furthermore, sexual minorities that are not explicitly named in the LGBTQIA+ acronym, but that significantly overlap with our communities, such as people who are sex workers, polyamorous, or HIV positive, to name a few, would not be abandoned for being too disreputable this time around. The same holds true for other multiply marginalized queer people. In fact, LGBTQIA+ movement and LGBTQIA+ movement that challenged all forms of sexualization would actually benefit all of its constituents and could facilitate coalitions across multiple social justice movements. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that sexualization is the only social force we need to challenge. While sexualization is certainly a component of sexism, racism, classism, ableism, and so on, there are other facets to these forms of marginalization that need to be addressed directly and intersectionally. But working to eradicate sexualization has the potential to positively impact not just LGBTQIA+ people, but women and other marginalized groups as well. So that's it for the reading part. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to hear any comments.